A hungry homeless man, rejected and humiliated, is brutally kicked out of a luxury restaurant. But fate takes a turn that no one saw coming. Imagine being thrown out of a place when all you wanted was a piece of food. Now imagine saving the life of the very same man who rejected you after a tragic accident. But what this homeless man revealed days later in the hospital left the restaurant owner completely in shock. How will this unexpected moment change both of their lives forever? Watch until the end to find out how one revelation can transform everything you thought you knew about redemption and second chances. The cold cut against Tom's skin as he approached the elegant restaurant, his trembling hands stuffed deep into the tattered pockets of his dirty coat. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and he knew he couldn't survive another night without eating. The glow of the restaurant's sophisticated lights seemed to mock his misery, but he decided to give it a try. Perhaps they could spare him a bit of food. That was all he wanted. Just a piece of bread or something no one else wanted. As he pushed open the heavy glass door, the warmth and the irresistible aroma of food enveloped him. His dirty clothes and unkempt beard made him look like a stranger in this environment. The glances cast his way were filled with disgust and discomfort. In the back of the dining room, he spotted a familiar face. It was the manager, an old colleague from his glory days in the kitchen, a man who for a moment showed surprise and empathy upon recognizing him. Tom thought about approaching him, but before he could take a single step, a firm, cold voice echoed through the room. "What are you doing here?" It was Stephen, the restaurant owner. Tall and imposing, with the arrogant posture of someone who had the world under control, he strode toward Tom with determined steps. "I know you," he said, crossing his arms and sizing Tom up. "You were the chef, weren't you? Look at what's left of you." Tom tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He wanted to explain that he was just hungry, but Stephen wouldn't allow it. "This restaurant isn't a shelter. If you want food, go dig through the trash where you belong now," he declared, with a cynical smile that made a point of showcasing his power. Each word cut like a sharp blade. He turned to the customers who watched the scene with morbid curiosity, and Tom's public humiliation became a spectacle for all. "Look, this man here was a chef, a great chef, awarded. Now look at him, a walking embarrassment." The discreet laughter and whispers echoed through the room. Tom's old colleague, the manager, tried to intervene, but Stephen raised his hand, silencing him with an authoritative gesture. "Get him out of here before he dirties the floor." Tom, his face burning with shame and his eyes misty, left in silence. The restaurant doors closed behind him, sealing the fact that he no longer belonged to that world. The cold of the street hit him again, but this time the greater pain was the contempt. His dignity had been stripped away in front of everyone. As he walked through the illuminated streets of Chicago, Tom felt the weight of each step as if the ground were about to swallow him. He wandered aimlessly, the sounds of the city blending with his memories. The cold bit into his skin, but what hurt more was what Stephen had done. It wasn't just the humiliation of being thrown out of a restaurant, it was the cruel reminder of who he had been and everything he had lost. Memories of his former life came rushing back like an avalanche. He found himself back in the kitchen of the restaurant he used to run. The warm lights, the shouts of the assistants, the clatter of pans, the orders flying through the kitchen. He was the chef. Not just any chef, but one of the most renowned in the city. His name graced magazine covers, awards adorned the walls, and photos of celebrities who praised his dishes were proudly displayed. Tom led his team with precision, passion, and authority. The food he created was art, and he knew it. There were parties, celebrations. He remembered his wife's smile, his little daughter laughing as she dashed around the table during the dinners that celebrated his victories. He had it all: family, respect, talent. But deep down, something began to erode that perfection. The stress, the pressure. He found relief in a drink, and then another. The relief became a habit, and the habit turned into an addiction. Tom saw himself sinking, but he couldn't stop. He recalled the night his wife left him. The shouts echoed in his mind like a storm. Sarah, his daughter, crying as he, intoxicated, tried to promise that he would change. But he didn't change, and then they were gone. The fall was swift and brutal. He lost the restaurant, the family, the life he loved, and now he was just a shadow wandering the streets with a pain he could not heal. When night finally fell, Tom found shelter in a dark park where other homeless people gathered in small groups. He didn't approach anyone. He sat alone on a bench, watching from a distance. The trees swayed in the cold wind, and the silence was only broken by distant laughter or the murmurs of muffled conversations. He watched the other homeless individuals. Some shared bits of food, others wrapped themselves in old blankets. There were small gestures of solidarity in that forgotten world, something Tom observed from afar but didn't feel part of. He wasn't one of them. At least he couldn't accept that yet. He looked up at the sky, trying to remember the last time he felt truly human. His thoughts drifted to Sarah. How was she now? She must have grown up, of course. She should be a woman by now, perhaps working, maybe in another city. He tried to recall the sound of her voice, the way she called him Daddy when she was little, but those memories were fading, just like everything he was. Tom couldn't hold back his tears. He felt like he had failed her, that he could never ask for forgiveness because he knew he didn't deserve it. The emptiness inside him was suffocating, and while the world moved on, he remained trapped in his guilt and regret. His sobs were muffled by the darkness around him. No one heard him. No one ever did. He lay down on the bench, covering himself with his thin coat. The wind blew relentlessly, but there was no cold that could be greater than the loneliness he carried. Tom closed his eyes, hoping sleep would come as a brief relief from the burden his life had become. Stephen's day had started early, as always. He was already impatient before even entering the restaurant, with the phone glued to his ear and a stack of documents in hand. His team was waiting for him to discuss the expansion of the restaurant chain, but he seemed distant, irritated, almost suffocated by the pressure. "This isn't good enough," he grumbled into the phone with one of his partners as he hurried through the kitchen, barely glancing at the staff. The anxious glances of the cooks followed him, but no one dared to question him. They knew Stephen was meticulous and demanding, and any slip-up could mean losing their jobs. "We need to cut costs," he continued, his voice firm and relentless. "And if that means firing half the staff, so be it. I'm trying to run an empire here, not a charity." He abruptly hung up the phone, slamming it down on the conference table. For Stephen, everything was always under control, or at least that's how he liked to think. Shortly thereafter, as he left the restaurant to address yet another urgent matter, Stephen got into his car and drove to a more remote area of the city. Passing by a homeless shelter, he spotted a group of people waiting for food. Without hesitation, he turned his face away, feeling the familiar disgust welling up inside him. To him, those men and women didn't deserve his time or compassion. They had made their choices, and now they had to face the consequences. Stephen firmly believed that everyone was responsible for their own destiny. "What are these people doing with their lives?" he murmured to himself, speeding up. "If only they had worked as hard as I have." And so, in a deliberate act, he averted his gaze and continued on his way, focused on his ambitions and business, unaware that on that very day, his life was about to change. Stephen was driving fast. The roar of the engine and the muffled sound of music on the radio were the only noises amidst the solitude of the deserted avenue. The city seemed distant there, on that forgotten stretch devoid of movement. The vastness of the road ahead should have brought peace, but instead, it only heightened his anxiety. His phone vibrated incessantly, and as always, he answered immediately, focused on a new negotiation for the expansion of his restaurant. "Is the investment guaranteed?" he asked urgently. "We can't afford to waste time on uncertainties. The deadline is tight." As he spoke, his eyes remained fixed on the rearview mirror, constantly checking how far he was from the restaurant and his next appointment. The conversation with his partner flowed, filled with numbers and promises of profit, when suddenly the harsh sound of a horn sliced through the air. Stephen swerved the steering wheel sharply, but it was too late. The car skidded through an intersection, crashed violently into a pole. The impact jolted Stephen in his seat as the car spun several times before finally coming to rest on the shoulder, its side crumpled against the lamp post. The silence that followed the accident was deafening. The radio had shut off, the phone lay on the car floor, and the distant sound of the wind blowing through the empty avenue filled the void. Dazed, Stephen tried to move but felt an intense pain in his leg and chest. He looked around, his eyes wide with panic, realizing he was trapped in the mangled vehicle. His breath quickened as he struggled to stay conscious, fear consuming him. For the first time in a long while, Stephen was not in control. The desolation surrounding him was terrifying. There was no one, no cars, no pedestrians. He tried to scream for help, but his voice was weak, almost inaudible. The panic intensified. Would he be left there for hours, alone and at the mercy of fate? In the distance, Tom wandered the empty streets, searching for cans and bottles to recycle, when he heard the sound of the accident. Curious and concerned, he followed the noise until he reached the desolate avenue, where in the distance he could see a car crumpled against a pole. Tom's heart raced, but something inside him urged him to walk towards the scene. As he got closer, he recognized the vehicle. In an instant, reality hit him like a punch to the gut. It was Stephen's car, the man who had humiliated him mercilessly, who had thrown him out onto the street with cruel words just a few nights before. He paused, his thoughts a chaotic mess. The temptation to walk away, to leave him to deal with his own misfortune, was strong. Tom closed his eyes, feeling the anger and resentment bubbling inside him. Leave him, he thought for a moment. He deserves it. But then he heard a weak groan coming from the car. Tom looked again. Stephen was trapped, his head leaning against the steering wheel, powerless to escape. Despite all the pain he carried, Tom knew he couldn't just turn his back. That wasn't who he was. Taking a deep breath, he ran to the car, trying to open the crumpled door. "Stephen, can you hear me?" he shouted, pulling on the handle with all his strength. The metal resisted, but Tom didn't give up. He used a piece of metal he found on the sidewalk to pry the door open, finally creating enough space to pull Stephen out. The weight of Stephen's body fell onto him, and Tom struggled to drag him onto the sidewalk. As he held Stephen in his arms, Tom looked at the man who had once humiliated him. Now he was vulnerable, injured, unable to defend himself or act with the arrogance that had once defined him. As the sounds of the ambulance approached, Tom stepped back, watching from the shadows as paramedics rushed to help him. Tom knew that at that moment, he had saved Stephen, not just physically but morally as well. He walked away from the scene, his emotions conflicting. What he had just done wasn't out of revenge, but rather out of a humanity that Stephen, until then, seemed to have never known. And for Tom, this was the beginning of something he couldn't yet fully understand, but he knew it would change both of them forever. Before continuing with the story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts so far. This is really important for the growth of the channel and helps me bring more stories like this one. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Stephen slowly awakened, the pain pulsing through his body like a cruel reminder of the accident. His eyelids felt heavy, and the fluorescent hospital light blinded his still bleary vision. He blinked several times, attempting to focus on his surroundings. The antiseptic smell and the distant sound of heart monitors quickly anchored him. He was in a hospital. But what made him freeze was the sight of the man sitting beside his bed, hands resting on his lap, eyes fixed on some distant point outside the window. It was Tom. The memory of that night he humiliated him in the restaurant surged through his mind like an electrical shock. That miserable figure he had scorned, How dare he be there beside him, as if he had the right to occupy that space? Stephen's discomfort quickly morphed into anger. He shifted in the bed, feeling a sharp pain shoot through his bandaged limbs, but irritation and pride wouldn't let him relent. "What are you doing here?" His voice emerged hoarse, yet laden with disdain. Tom, silent, diverted his gaze from the window and locked eyes with Stephen, but did not respond immediately. "I don't need your pity," Stephen continued, gritting his teeth as he tried to move again, feeling the sting in his ribs. You think you can save me and then sit here like a hero? I didn't ask for your help." Tom remained calm, his expression tired yet resolute. There was no reaction to the venom in Stephen's words. Instead, he sat there in silence, as if patiently awaiting a storm he already knew. Stephen's breath quickened, frustration building in his chest, not just from his weakened state, but from the humiliation of being saved by someone he viewed as inferior. "Get out of here," Stephen commanded, his voice thick with desperation disguised as fury. But Tom did not move. "I said, get out!" Stephen tried again to rise, ignoring the agony that was nearly causing him to black out. He was about to scream for a nurse, anyone who could remove him from this humiliating situation when his strength failed him. The physical pain forced him to stop, and for a moment he lay still, staring at Tom as if the mere fact of his presence was a blow to his pride. Tom remained silent for a few moments, his heavy eyes fixed on the floor, as if searching for the strength to finally share what he had been carrying inside for so long. Stephen, still immobilized by the pain and confusion, could feel the tension in the air. Finally, Tom took a deep breath, his voice low and laden with emotion. "You think you know everything about me, Stephen. You looked at me that night in the restaurant and decided who I was. A nobody, a failure. But let me tell you something. You have no idea what brought me here." Stephen, used to always controlling the conversation, remained quiet. There was something in Tom's voice, in the way he spoke each word, that prevented him from interrupting. There was a weight there, a weight Stephen had never imagined. "I was just like you. No, I was exactly like you," Tom began, his voice carrying pain, but also a strange acceptance. "I had a restaurant, a family, everything you have today. I thought I was invincible on top of the world, and I loved showing that to everyone. I'd walk past my staff without looking them in the eyes, making decisions like no one else mattered. Just like you." Stephen felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He was about to say something, but Tom's words were like a mirror he didn't want to face. Tom continued. "I had a daughter, Sarah. She was my world, Stephen. Everything I did, I used to say it was for her. But really it was for me, for my ego, for my success. I started drinking to cope with the pressure. At first it was just a few drinks after work, you know? No big deal. But the problem with success, Stephen, is that it consumes you. You start to think you need it, that the world revolves around you, and before you know it, you've lost control." Stephen blinked, Tom's words sinking into his mind like needles. He had never imagined that this man, the homeless person he despised, had once been like him, had been as high up as he was now. "I lost everything, Stephen. Everything," Tom said, his voice cracking for the first time. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "My daughter, my wife, they left. I was so blinded by success, by the idea that I was invincible, that I didn't see what I was losing until it was too late. And then the restaurant I loved crumbled too. Addiction, debt, everything I built went down the drain. And then I ended up here, on the streets, lost. I looked in the mirror and didn't even recognize who I was anymore." Stephen was frozen. Tom's story was eerily similar to his own trajectory, except in Tom's case, he had already fallen. Stephen began to wonder if the same fate awaited him. Was he heading down the same path? "I didn't ask to be saved by anyone, Stephen," Tom said, his eyes finally meeting Stephen's. "Just like you didn't. But when I saw you in that car, when I recognized your face, I realized you were who I used to be. Arrogant, proud, blind, and yet I pulled you out. Because I knew what the fall was like, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone, not even you." Tom's words hung in the room. The silence that followed was thick, as if the air around them had become heavier. Stephen tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He was feeling something he had long avoided: fear. Not fear of the accident, but fear of being exactly where Tom had been, of following the same self-destructive path. "You judge me, Stephen," Tom continued, his voice low but intense. "You see me as a failure, a homeless man. But you're closer to being me than you realize. And if you keep going like this, you'll end up exactly like I did. Alone, lost, invisible to the world." Stephen took a deep breath, trying to process it all. Tom wasn't just a man who had fallen. He was the reflection of a future Stephen had never considered. For the first time, Stephen realized that the success he valued so much could become a prison. He looked at Tom, not with disdain, but with a new, silent admiration. Tom was offering a second chance, one that Stephen hadn't even known he needed. Tom slowly stood and left the room, leaving Stephen drowning in the suffocating silence of his own thoughts. The weight of Tom's words pressed down on him like a vice, each syllable echoing in his mind, forcing him to confront a reality he had never allowed himself to see. "You're closer to being me than you realize." The truth of that statement gnawed at him, mingling with the haunting memories of the accident, the sudden loss of control, the violent crash of metal against the pole, and the terrifying realization that, in a heartbeat, everything he had built could be stripped away. But it wasn't the memory of the accident that unsettled him most. It was Tom's story, a brutal mirror of the path Stephen himself was on. A man who once had it all, brought to his knees by the very arrogance and pride that Stephen now recognized in himself. The fear that had gripped him during the crash paled in comparison to the fear creeping into his soul now, the fear that Tom's fall wasn't an anomaly, but a glimpse into his own future. In that moment, amid the chaos, Stephen was certain he was going to die. Everything he valued, his restaurant, his success, his status, vanished in an instant. None of it saved him when the car finally stopped, and he found himself trapped, unable to move. He had spent his life looking down on others, convinced he was above everything, everyone. And in the end, the only one who reached out to save him was the man he had humiliated. The irony was painful. He closed his eyes, trying to push away the growing sense of emptiness. The accident had left him shattered, but something deeper had broken within him. For the first time, Stephen began to perceive the fragility of everything he considered important. His life, built on material achievements, suddenly seemed meaningless. The success he had prized so highly hadn't provided him the security he thought it did. The vision of the wrecked car invaded his mind repeatedly. The sound of Tom breaking the door, the weight of his body being pulled out, and Tom's hand holding his, bringing him back to life. What did that mean? How could someone he despised be responsible for giving him a second chance? Stephen felt more lost than ever. But one thing was certain. The accident was not merely a physical collision. It was the beginning of something much larger, something he still couldn't comprehend, but that would haunt him forever. Stephen couldn't sleep. Tom's words and the memories of the accident spun in his mind night after night. The idea that he, the arrogant owner of a culinary empire, had been saved by a man he despised gnawed at him from within. It was impossible to ignore the irony and emptiness that now surrounded his thoughts. But the guilt wouldn't fade. He needed to do something. He needed to give back, even if it was just to lighten the burden he carried. On the day he was discharged from the hospital, Stephen returned to the restaurant, feeling more fragile than ever. Despite maintaining his usual demeanor, the arrogance had given way to a vulnerability he didn't yet know how to control. He called Tom into his office, a spacious area adorned with awards and certificates hanging on the walls. The man who sat across from him felt out of place in that environment, his shoulders hunched, his gaze empty. It was hard to believe that this man had once been a celebrated chef. Stephen took a deep breath. "I've been thinking," he began, avoiding direct eye contact with Tom. "I want to offer you a job here at the restaurant. Something simple to start, maybe as a kitchen assistant." The words came out faster than he intended. "It's the least I can do, considering what you did for me." Tom sat in silence for a long moment. His gaze was fixed on Stephen, but there was no immediate expression of surprise or gratitude. Instead, he seemed to weigh the words, trying to decipher the true motive behind the offer. "Do you think this will absolve you of your guilt?" Tom's words were direct, cutting through the air with honesty. Stephen felt the sting, but tried not to show it. I just want to help." Tom sighed, crossing his arms. "I'm not doing this out of charity, Stephen. I will accept the job, but know that I'm doing it for myself, for my daughter." He lowered his head, his eyes dark. "I need something that connects me to her again. If that means going back to a kitchen, then so be it." The tension between them was palpable. Both knew that this offer was not merely a gesture of goodwill. It was a desperate attempt to ease Stephen's heavy conscience, and for Tom, a chance at redemption he wasn't sure he deserved. Tom's first days at the restaurant were hell. From the moment he stepped into the kitchen, suspicious glances followed him. He could feel the judgment in every gesture, in every whispered word among the staff. To them, Tom was just a homeless man who had received a favor from the boss. Someone without value, without a place there. He tried to ignore the looks, focusing on the tasks assigned to him, even if they were the most simple and humble: washing vegetables, chopping ingredients, or cleaning the floor. The feeling of discomfort and inadequacy was overwhelming, but Tom kept his composure. He knew that reacting would only confirm the low expectations others had of him. However, as the days passed, the tension escalated. He heard whispers behind his back, cruel jokes about his appearance, his condition, and how he shouldn't be there. Tom felt each of these words like knives, but he didn't retaliate. He had promised himself he wouldn't fall again. Then, on a particularly chaotic afternoon when the kitchen was flooded with orders and everyone's nerves were frayed, Tom had an unexpected opportunity. The sous chef, overwhelmed and unable to coordinate the dishes quickly, shouted for help. The other cooks hesitated, and before they could react, Tom approached the counter and started working. His movements, slow at first, soon gained precision and speed. In no time, Tom was leading the preparation of a dish he hadn't cooked in years, a dish that used to be his signature. He executed it with the same passion and skill as in his glory days, and when he finished, the other cooks watched in silence. There were no more jokes or whispers, just respect. The dish was served. The customer, delighted with the flavor and presentation, requested to meet the chef. The sous chef, in a rare gesture of acknowledgement, pointed to Tom. That was the first glimpse of dignity Tom had felt in a long time. Respect began to grow slowly among his colleagues, and even though the path ahead was still long, Tom realized that something within him was beginning to heal. As Tom began to rediscover himself in the kitchen, Stephen watched from a distance. He didn't interfere in the daily operations of the kitchen, but observed every step Tom took. And with each new move, Stephen saw something that deeply disturbed him. He saw himself. Not the arrogant Stephen who controlled everything, but the Stephen who could have been. Tom's words about losing everything echoed constantly in Stephen's mind. If it hadn't been for the accident, for that moment when everything stopped, forcing him to confront his own mortality, he wondered what would have happened to him. The path Tom had traveled, from success to ruin, no longer felt so far from Stephen's reality. He had the restaurant, the prestige, but also the same arrogance that he now saw as the beginning of Tom's downfall. Stephen began to question everything. What was he really building? For whom? The relentless pursuit of more, of expansion, of status, suddenly felt empty. He spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling of his luxurious apartment, wondering if his life truly held any value beyond what money and material success could buy. With each day watching Tom work, Stephen became increasingly aware that he wasn't just witnessing a chef's rediscovery. He was seeing himself, or the version he could have become if the accident hadn't abruptly halted his trajectory. The similarities between them were haunting and at the same time revealing. Stephen realized that, like Tom, he too needed something more, something that gave meaning to his life beyond everything he had always valued. As much as he didn't want to admit it, Stephen knew he was beginning to change, and that terrified him just as much as the accident had. Stephen's nights had not been the same since the accident. The bed, no matter how comfortable, felt like a place where his thoughts intensified, becoming louder, impossible to silence. Every time he closed his eyes, he relived the accident. The sound of the car colliding with the pole, the metal screeching, and the absolute emptiness of the dark road replayed like a film. Stephen would wake in the middle of the night, his body drenched in sweat, heart racing, trying to remind himself that he was safe, trying to convince himself that it was all in the past. But the nightmares were not only about the accident. There was something deeper rooted within them. In a recurring dream, Stephen drove down a never-ending road, the lights of the restaurant fading in the background as he drifted further away, unable to stop. In the dream, he was alone. There were no voices, only the growing sensation that he was losing something he would never recover. At the height of his anguish, Tom's face would appear. First as the man he had humiliated, then as the man who saved him. Always the same image, Tom reaching out, pulling him from the car. In reality, Stephen felt more lost with each passing day. He would get out of bed in the morning with a weight on his shoulders, an emptiness he didn't know how to fill. The restaurant, once his greatest source of pride, now felt irrelevant, a distant echo of something that no longer mattered. He dragged himself to work, reviewing reports, supervising the team, but with a constant sense that everything was futile. The impact of the accident and the presence of Tom were rooted in his mind, and nothing seemed capable of dispelling that shadow. The nights followed this same routine. Nightmares, cold sweats, the weight of silence in the dark. Stephen knew he needed to face what was happening inside him, but he still didn't know how. Tom was still trying to adapt to his new routine at the restaurant when he saw her. Sarah. It was a busy night. The restaurant was full, and Tom was in the kitchen helping prepare dishes for the customers. Amidst the chaos, he spotted her sitting at one of the tables with a group of friends. Tom's heart nearly stopped. He hadn't seen her in years. Sarah had grown up. She looked so different from the little girl he remembered. But her eyes were the same. At first, he thought about avoiding the confrontation. He didn't want to cause embarrassment. He didn't want her to feel uncomfortable with him being there. But something within Tom refused to keep running away. He needed to talk to her, even if it was just for a moment. As the sous chef was busy with orders, Tom took off his apron, wiped his hands, and walked from the kitchen toward the dining area. Each step felt heavier than the last, fear swelling in his chest. What if she rejected him? What if she hated him? When he finally approached her, Sarah noticed him. Her eyes widened for a second, her expression shifting from surprise to something darker, more restrained. Tom tried to smile, hoping to convey something. Perhaps hope, perhaps regret. "Sarah," he began, his voice faltering slightly, "I just wanted to say hi." But Sarah's face hardened. She glanced around, realizing that her friends had also noticed the interaction. Her expression was one of pure discomfort, almost disgust. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was low, but the tone of accusation was clear. Tom took a deep breath, struggling to stay calm. "I'm working here now, trying to get back on my feet. I thought maybe we could talk, just talk." Sarah shook her head, her eyes filling with anger. "Talk? Now you want to talk? After everything? After years of not even caring where I was or what I was doing?" She stood up from the table, her friends watching the scene, unsure how to react. "You're late, Dad." Her words struck deeper than anything Tom had ever felt. She walked away without looking back. He stood there, frozen, feeling the stares on him. When she disappeared through the restaurant door, he knew his worst fear had become reality. Sarah didn't want him back in her life. She had rejected him, clearly and definitively, and there was nothing more he could do. After the incident with Sarah, Tom returned to the kitchen, but something inside him had shattered. He worked in silence, focused on the tasks at hand, but any spark of hope that had remained was extinguished. Stephen, watching from a distance, noticed the change in Tom. He saw the moment Tom left the dining area, the crushing weight of rejection clearly etched on his face. Stephen knew something significant had happened, something he couldn't fully comprehend. But for some reason, he felt a strong empathy for Tom. He understood what it was like to feel powerless, to have something beyond his control. And for the first time in a long while, Stephen felt the need to talk to someone, to connect in a way he had never allowed himself before. That night, after the shift ended, Stephen approached Tom while he was cleaning the kitchen. There was a heavy silence between them, but Stephen knew he had to break it. Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain. Tom paused for a moment, wiping his hands on a dishcloth before responding. "No," he said with raw honesty, "but it's not like I can do anything about it." Stephen took a deep breath, unsure how to continue, but he felt he owed something to Tom. "I saw you talking to a girl tonight. She seemed important to you." Tom nodded, his gaze distant. "She's my daughter." The silence that followed was heavy. Stephen didn't know what to say. He felt the weight of the revelation and how it affected Tom. For the first time, he understood that what Tom was trying to reclaim was much more than a job or dignity. It was his family, his very life. Stephen saw himself reflected there. He also knew what it was like to lose something precious. "I lost my daughter," Tom finally said, his voice hoarse. "And I don't know if I'll ever get her back." Stephen remained silent, feeling an unexpected connection with the man he had once despised. Suddenly, the emptiness Stephen felt seemed smaller in light of Tom's pain. He realized that just like Tom, he was also trying to rise from a fall that could have destroyed everything. They were both struggling, in different ways, for redemption. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment. This is essential for the growth of the channel and encourages me to bring more emotional content like this. Now, let's continue with the story. Stephen sat in the spacious conference room, the cool lights reflecting off the polished surfaces of the marble table. In front of him were the two partners who had helped finance the restaurant, both impatient, each with folders stuffed with documents, graphs, and financial projections. They spoke at the same time, their voices intertwined in a continuous discourse about profit maximization, brand expansion, and the immense potential that transforming the restaurant into a fast food chain would bring. To Stephen, their words sounded like a distant buzz, an irritating distraction from what truly mattered. He could barely hear what they were saying. All he could think about was what was at stake. For years, he had chased success, money, and recognition. And in many ways, he had achieved it. But now, everything felt hollow. He knew that if he followed the path his partners suggested, he would lose the essence of what the restaurant meant to him. And more importantly, he would lose his last chance at redemption. "You're not listening, Stephen," one of the partners said, tapping his fingers on the table. "If you don't follow this plan, you're throwing away millions. Do you understand? Millions." Stephen remained silent for a few seconds, reflecting on the proposal. The numbers made sense, but his heart was elsewhere. He remembered Tom and the work they were doing together. Every dish they prepared was an attempt to reconnect with something deeper, a search for purpose. Transforming that restaurant into a fast food chain would be an insult to everything he now valued. It would mean a return to the selfishness and materialism that had almost consumed him. "No," Stephen finally said, with a firmness he hadn't felt in a long time. I won't sell my soul for a few more million." The words echoed in the room, catching the partners by surprise. "You're kidding, right?" one of the partners asked incredulously. "You're really going to throw all of this away for some romantic idea of, I don't know, authenticity?" Stephen looked at the men in front of him, feeling for the first time that he was finally in control of his own life. "You don't understand," he replied calmly. "It's not just a restaurant, it's everything I am. And I'd rather lose money than lose what truly matters." The silence that followed was heavy, but Stephen didn't back down. He knew his decision was risky, but for the first time in a long time, he felt he was doing the right thing. After the tense meeting with his partners, Stephen threw himself into the restaurant, dedicating himself to the kitchen like never before. He knew that transforming his restaurant into something that reflected his new vision of life was the only way to save what he had built. He and Tom spent long hours in the kitchen, experimenting with ingredients, discussing flavors, and the memories each dish evoked. Every new dish they created was an attempt to capture the essence of their personal journeys. For Tom, working in the kitchen was more than just a return to his roots. It was a chance to reconnect with the one thing he still felt could save him, his passion for cooking. Every dish he created was a memory of better times, a piece of his soul he was trying to restore. He wanted his daughter Sarah to see the man he was trying to become, someone worthy of respect, deserving of love. For Stephen, the process was a way to redeem himself, not just in Tom's eyes, but in his own. He knew that the restaurant, if transformed correctly, could be something more than just a business. He wanted to create a space where people felt something beyond hunger. They wanted them to feel a purpose, a story in every dish. On a particularly productive night, they finalized a dish that both knew was special. It was a combination of traditional and modern flavors, something that perfectly represented the fusion of their paths. Stephen tasted the dish, closing his eyes as the flavors danced in his mouth. "This," he said with a subtle smile, "this is the main dish for the new menu." Tom nodded with a slight gesture, feeling a rare pride swell in his chest. They had created something together, something that transcended the simple act of cooking. But for Tom, the true test was yet to come. The fundraising event, where he desperately hoped his daughter would see him as the man he was trying to be. Someone changed, someone worthy of forgiveness. The fundraising event was an important night for the restaurant. It was Stephen's first big chance to showcase his new vision to the world, and for Tom, it was an opportunity to redeem himself in front of Sarah. He knew she would be there, and it filled him with a mix of hope and fear. He understood that he had hurt his daughter in irreparable ways, but he believed that if she saw the man he was striving to become, there might be a chance for reconciliation. The hall was filled with guests, all mingling among the tables as they sampled the new dishes. Stephen was at the center of it all, discussing his new culinary philosophy with attendees, while Tom discreetly watched from afar. Then he saw her. Sarah entered the hall with some friends, her curious gaze distant. Tom's heart leapt in his chest. He knew he couldn't miss this chance. Tom approached cautiously, nervous. He struggled to find the right words, fearing he might say something that would push her away even further. "Sarah," he began, his voice trembling. "I wanted to show you what I'm doing here. I'm trying to change. I'm trying to be a better person." Sarah looked at him for a moment, her expression cold and distant. "Do you really think that's enough?" she said, devoid of emotion. "Do you think cooking a few dishes will make up for all the years you abandoned me? That it will erase what you did?" Tom swallowed hard, feeling her words hit him like daggers. "No, I know it can't make up for the past, but I want to show you that I'm trying. I want to make things right." Sarah shook her head, her expression growing even harsher. "It doesn't matter how hard you try. You'll never fix what you broke. Some things can't be repaired, Dad." She turned away and left, leaving Tom standing in the middle of the hall, feeling the weight of his defeat. Tears filled his eyes, but he held them back. He couldn't let others see his weakness. He knew that despite all his efforts, he might never regain his daughter's love. And that pain, more than anything else, tore him apart inside. The hall was packed, and the murmur of conversations among the guests echoed off the restaurant walls. The atmosphere was celebratory, but Stephen felt a growing tension inside him. He had something important to say, something that had been building up since the accident, and now, amidst the fundraising event, it was the right moment to let it out. The microphone stood before him, waiting for his words. Tom was at the back, silent, his emotions hidden behind a mask of calm after the painful encounter with his daughter. Sarah, now seated with her friends, looked at her father with a mix of curiosity and distance. Stephen cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the room. Conversations faded, and all eyes turned to him. "Before we continue with the event, I would like to say a few words, something I've been holding on to for a while." He paused, taking a deep breath. "As many of you know, I was in an accident a few months ago, and in that moment I was certain that my life was over." The room fell into complete silence. Even Sarah, who had seemed distant before, was now focused on Stephen. "I always thought that success and control were everything," Stephen continued. "But when the car spun and crashed, none of that mattered. I was on the brink of death, completely powerless. And ironically, the person who saved me that day was someone I had scorned, humiliated, a man who had every reason to leave me there and move on, but he didn't." Stephen paused, his gaze meeting Tom's across the room. "Tom, you didn't just save my physical life. You made me see something I had never considered, the importance of second chances. We both know what it's like to lose everything. But you showed me that even after a fall, it's possible to stand up and start over again." Tom kept his eyes down, still processing his devastating encounter with Sarah, but Stephen's words, filled with gratitude and vulnerability, deeply moved everyone in the room. "The truth is, we all need second chances," Stephen continued, his voice steady yet emotional. "I had been so focused on building an empire that I forgot what really mattered, and now I want to do something that truly has meaning." He looked at the guests, and for a moment it seemed he was speaking directly to Sarah. "If it weren't for Tom, I wouldn't be here today. And for that I want to publicly thank you. To you, Tom, for saving me, and for showing me that life is not just about what we achieve, but about whom we help along the way." Applause started timidly but soon filled the room, mingling with the emotion that now permeated the air. Sarah, sitting in silence, observed the interaction between her father and Stephen. Something was changing within her. For the first time, she began to see Tom's efforts in a new light, even if she still didn't know what that meant for their future. The commotion following Stephen's speech was still reverberating through the hall when suddenly an alarm blared. Emergency lights began to flash, and the smell of smoke quickly filled the kitchen. Panic took hold of the staff, and the lively conversations of the guests were replaced by screams of confusion. Stephen, still holding the microphone, looked around with wide eyes. "Everyone, exit calmly!" he shouted, trying to control the situation as chaos ensued. The patrons started moving toward the emergency exits as Stephen ran toward the kitchen to assess the extent of the fire. Smoke was already thick, and he saw that a forgotten pan on the stove had ignited, quickly spreading to the cabinets. "Close the kitchen and get everyone out of here!" he yelled to the manager. In the midst of the turmoil, a young staff member, new to the team, was trapped in a corner of the kitchen, surrounded by flames. He was screaming for help, his eyes filled with terror. Without hesitation, Tom, who was helping coordinate the evacuation, saw the situation and ran toward the young man, his instinct to protect others overpowering any concern for his own safety. "Tom, no!" Stephen shouted, realizing what was happening, but Tom had already crossed through the flames, covering his face with a wet cloth. The heat was unbearable, the fire roaring around him. He reached the young man, who was paralyzed with fear, and grabbed him, pulling him forcefully away from the flames. The kitchen was total chaos. The wooden cabinets and metal utensils began to crackle and collapse under the heat. With great effort, Tom managed to get the young man to safety, pushing him out of the kitchen. However, as he turned to escape, a structure collapsed nearby, knocking him to the ground. Tom tried to get up, but his body was exhausted, his strength fading. He had saved the young man, but knew he was now trapped. Stephen, in desperation, ran toward Tom. "Tom! Tom! Get out of there!" he shouted, trying to push through the smoke and flames. But before he could reach him, firefighters arrived and pulled him back. Stephen yelled in frustration as he watched Tom being carried out unconscious from the building. The tension was palpable. Tom had risked everything once again, this time not to save his own soul, but to ensure another's safety. The hours that followed were long and silent. The restaurant was destroyed, and Tom had been rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Stephen sat by Tom's bedside, his thoughts racing. He looked at the unconscious man, the tubes and monitors keeping his body functioning. Tom's sacrifice was more than physical. He had put his life on the line for another without hesitation. It was something Stephen had never understood before meeting him. The fire seemed to symbolize the end of an era. The restaurant, which had once stood for profit and status, was now reduced to ashes. But amidst that devastation, Stephen felt something ignite within him. He realized he had the chance to do something much bigger than just rebuild the restaurant as it was before. He could honor Tom's sacrifice in a meaningful way. While Tom fought for his life, Stephen made a decision. He gathered the partners for a brief meeting and announced that he would transform the restaurant into a community center. The idea was simple but powerful. The restaurant would serve meals for both the wealthy and the needy, side by side. It wouldn't just be a place to showcase status, but a space where people from all backgrounds could come together, share stories, and help one another. The partners were incredulous, but Stephen was determined. He would use the fire insurance to fund the change. "This place was built to serve more than just food," he said. "It will be a space for reconnection, for humanity. All of this is thanks to Tom." As Tom remained unconscious, Stephen knew that his life had changed forever. He was no longer the man who only sought profit. Now he was determined to leave a legacy that truly mattered. The hospital room where Tom lay was a place of profound silence, interrupted only by the soft, rhythmic sounds of the machines monitoring his vital signs. The environment was cold and sterile, but for Stephen, that room had become a sacred space, a place where he visited his friend every day, talking to him as if Tom could hear him. Even though he was in a coma, Stephen believed, or perhaps hoped, that somehow his words reached him. Every morning, Stephen would bring a chair and sit by Tom's bedside, watching his chest rise and fall slowly. "You know, Tom, the restaurant, it's taking shape again," Stephen began, running his hand through his hair, a gesture that had become a nervous reflex. "But not in the same way as before. I've decided it will be a community center. You taught me that. Food can be more than just a meal. It can be a way to bring people together, to help others, to find redemption." He leaned forward, gripping the hospital blanket, his expression weary yet resolute. "If you don't wake up, I promise I will carry this on. This place will carry your legacy, Tom. People will remember you, not for what you lost, but for what you saved, for the change you brought." Stephen visited Tom every day, sharing stories about the restaurant, plans for the future, and the small victories he had achieved in renovating the space. Sometimes the feeling of talking to someone who didn't respond was suffocating, but he refused to give up. There was a debt there, one he knew he might never fully repay. Still, he promised Tom in each visit that he would carry forward what had united them, the desire to create something meaningful. Days passed slowly, and even though Tom remained motionless, Stephen held on to the hope that his friend would return. Finally, a month after the fire, the door to the hospital room opened, and this time it was not Stephen who entered. Sarah stood at the door, hesitating. Her eyes carried a mix of guilt and fear. She looked at her father's immobile body, connected to tubes and wires, and her heart tightened with pain. It was hard to face the reality of seeing Tom in that state, and even harder to accept that he had risked his life for someone else, just as he had tried to rebuild their relationship. Slowly, Sarah approached, pulling a chair closer to the bed. She looked at Tom's face, aged and marked by years of suffering. Tears began to spill down her cheeks, silent and heavy. Tentatively at first, she reached out, but then more firmly, grasping her father's hand for the first time in many years. It was warm, surprisingly comforting, even though he could not feel it.
"Dad,"
she began, her voice fragile and trembling.
I'm so sorry for everything."
Sarah took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall.
"I was so hard on you, and I know you were trying. I didn't know how to deal with it. I thought you had abandoned me, that you would never be the man I once knew again."
The words came out with difficulty, but they were honest, raw. Sarah knew this moment was more for her than for him. "I never said this before, but I always missed you. Even when I was angry, I wanted you around. I wanted things to be different." She squeezed his hand tighter, as if trying to pull him back to reality, to life. "You were a hero, you know? You risked your life to save someone else. That's who you really are, Dad. Not the man that addiction turned you into. You are better than that. You always were." For a moment, Sarah closed her eyes, resting her head against his hand in a gesture of affection she had long denied herself. "I forgive you. I just wish I had told you this sooner." Days went by without much change, but that morning, as the sun gently rose through the hospital window, something different happened. The room was enveloped in a comforting silence when Tom, after weeks in a coma, began to show signs of movement. First, it was a slight tremor in his fingers, almost imperceptible, then a small contraction of his lips, as if he were trying to speak. Sarah was beside the bed, still holding her father's hand, when she noticed the movement. Her heart raced. "Dad!" she called, her voice almost choked with hope and fear that it might just be an illusion. Tom, with visible effort, opened his eyes. His vision was blurred, the world around him seemed distant and confusing, but he sensed something, someone. He tried to focus, and gradually the image of Sarah began to take shape. He blinked several times, his breathing heavy and irregular, but as he finally recognized her, a solitary tear rolled down the corner of his eye. "Sarah!" The word came out almost inaudibly, a whisper filled with emotion. Tom's voice was hoarse, weak, but it carried more weight than any other word he had ever spoken. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with surprise and relief. "Dad! Oh my God, Dad, you're back!" She leaned in to embrace him carefully, tears now flowing freely, a mix of joy and relief. Tom, still recovering from the confusion of awakening, tried to lift his hand to caress her face, but his strength had not fully returned. Even so, he smiled, a weak but genuine smile. "I knew you'd come," he murmured, his voice faltering but full of tenderness. Sarah hugged him tighter, feeling that they were finally together again. "I'm here, Dad. I'm here. And we're going to have a new chance, I promise." Tom closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the peace that had long eluded him. He had fought so hard to reclaim the life he lost, and now, even with the scars of the past, there was hope. Sarah's forgiveness was everything he had always wanted, and now, in her arms, he knew the future, though uncertain, would be better than he had imagined. Stephen, who had been watching the scene from the doorway, quietly slipped out without making a sound. He knew this was their moment, the moment of redemption that Tom had sought for so long. Outside, life continued, but something was different. Stephen, too, felt at peace, knowing that everything they had built together, all the changes they had initiated, now had a greater purpose. And so, the man who was despised and humiliated turned a tragedy into an opportunity for redemption, not just for himself, but for the restaurant owner as well. Life has an unexpected way of teaching us that everyone deserves a second chance, and sometimes the most powerful lessons come from those we least expect. In the end, it's not about where we are now, but who we choose to be when fate offers us a new opportunity. What would you have done in this situation? How did this story touch you? Comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this emotional story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future stories. Leave a like and let me know what you thought in the comments. It really helps the channel grow. And of course, don't leave yet. Click on the end screen card to watch the next video. I'm sure you'll love it too. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.